Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Now, US President Donald Trump has announced on Monday that as part of his vow to bring Iran exports to zero, waivers to the 8 countries to import oil from Iran will not be renewed. As a result, oil prices in the international market have jumped to new highs. US crude surged by 2.4% to $65.57 per barrel in New York. Brent crude, which is used to essentially price international oils, has jumped by 2.6% to $73.80 per barrel. Now, with the price jump, decrease in oil production, what with zero input from Venezuela due to sanctions, and now Iran, and also OPEC's December slash on production to stabilize the supply glut from earlier, a deficiency is expected. However, Khalid Al-Faleh, Saudi Arabia's energy minister and the de facto OPEC leader, has said that Saudi Arabia will, with other oil producers, make sure that there is enough oil available for consumers and that the global oil market isn't knocked off balance. That's really convenient. Now, in November last year, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo had announced US sanctions against Iran, including oil exemptions for 8 countries. These countries were India, Japan, China, Greece, Turkey, Italy, South Korea, and Taiwan. They were given 6 months to reprieve to bring down the oil imports from Iran to zero. Even then, oil prices initially shot higher due to fears about the loss of supply from Iran, which was then the world's 5th biggest producer of crude. Saudi Arabia now responded by ramping up production to an all-time high. However, the US administration, fearing an oil shock that would cripple the economy, granted waivers to China, India, and 6 other nations. Now, this kind of approach left oil markets oversupplied. Some nations have already, however, weaned themselves off of Iran's oil, and I'm talking about those 8 countries who had these waivers. Italy, Greece, and Taiwan haven't loaded any Iranian barrels since November almost. China, on the other hand, along with Japan and Korea and Turkey, have imported more oil from Iran than the waivers allowed them to, according to the International Energy Agency. So we're now joined by analyst Mr. Yusuf Erim, joining us from TRT World in Istanbul, and also analyst Mostafa Khoshcheshm, who is joining us from Tehran. Welcome to Newswire. Let me start with you, Mr. Khoshcheshm. How do you see this latest announcements of the waivers not being renewed, and how will Iran cope?
Thanks for having me. Well, as a matter of fact, there are a number of issues to be discussed in here. One is the real impact of the decision on Iran and on global economy, and if this decision would mean anything to Iran as far as sanctions are meant to bring Tehran to the negotiating table. Another question is if Iran has ways to bypass these sanctions, if Iran could avoid the move by Washington to zero down its exports, crude exports. And if it could, Iran's supplies could be replaced by anyone, including Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Well, first things first, this decision by the White House seems to be more a psychological move in order to leave psychological impacts on the Iranians, the nation, the Iranian domestic market, and as well as officials, and to have some kind of domestic consumption for Donald Trump back at home. Why? Because Iran has proved to be able to bypass the sanctions. Ever since the Iraqi war on Iran started more than 2 decades ago, Iran has been facing sanctions on its crude supplies, and it has been able to, open up conduits and it's been using various means to bypass the sanctions. Just to put it, in a nutshell, I'd rather mention that the United States mentioned that they meant to bring Iran's crude supplies to 1 million barrels a day ever since they reimposed the sanctions. But in the last 6 months, Iran has been supplying the market, according to international figures, somewhere between 1.5 million to 1.7 million barrels a day. And only in the last 3 weeks, it has exported over 1.5 million barrels.
Well, it could be debated that one of the reasons that it has managed to get that figure of exports of oils is because China and other 8 countries, the rest of the 8 countries who are part of this waiver, have been buying more than they were allowed to.
Well, there are a number of reasons. First is that three of those that have received the waivers, Taiwan, Italy, and Greece, they have never supplied crude from Iran in the last 6 months, despite receiving waivers. The Chinese, Turkey, and India have, received more supplies. Japanese and Koreans, they even halted imports from Iran for the first 2 or 3 months after receiving the waivers. But all of them have started oversupplying in the last 2 or 3 months in anticipation of such a move by Washington.
Okay, Mr. Matteo Bryza, you've just joined us. You're a former U.S. diplomat joining us from Istanbul. Welcome to Newswire. How do you see this latest announcement by President Trump? As our guest said, is this psychological warfare on Iran to add pressure, or will it have real geopolitical effects?
Oh, I think this is intended as a real geopolitical tool or even a weapon to try to squeeze the Iranian regime economically as much as possible. And so my guess is there could be some geopolitical effects. I mean, whether that means a change of the government of Iran is way too early to tell. But I personally believe that is the objective of the Trump administration.
But doesn't this have a bigger negative effect on international oil prices? I mean, it puts the entire market off balance by this move. Clearly, it's not been thought out in what Trump's latest move is.
I think you're exactly right in it being contradictory to another of President Trump's goals, which is to keep oil prices low. This obviously, as you're suggesting, is leading to higher oil prices. It's all going to come down to how much the UAE and Saudi Arabia will be able to increase production to fill the gap. Now, this is all happening against the backdrop, though, of potential shocks in supply and shortages from Venezuela and Libya. So I agree. The timing is terrible.
The timing is terrible, and we're joined by Mr. Yusuf Erim, an analyst from TRT World, joining us from Istanbul. Mr. Yusuf, what's your take on it, even considering the timing, not just of the oil prices in the market, but also won't this give other countries, and like Mr. Khoshcheshm mentioned, a workaround for Iran also to manage other ways to import and export oil?
Well, first thing, I think the United States is overstepping right now. What they're trying to do is not just hurt the regime in Iran, but they're hurting the Iranian people, and they're also putting in jeopardy the energy security of the 8 countries that received the waiver. Now, when you look at these countries, they have weaned off. I'm going to talk about Turkey more specifically because it's my expertise, as Turkey has come down from 200,000 barrels to 60,000 barrels. Now they want them to go down to 0 by, I believe, May 3rd. This is ridiculous. Iran's the one being sanctioned, but these other 8 countries are being punished as well.
And Turkey's been very vocal. In fact, the foreign minister has vocally protested, hasn't he?
He has been, because energy security is an important part of the national security portfolio. And if your energy is unsecure, this is going to have big ramifications on other parts of other sectors of the country's government, the way they handle business. Now, what the United States is trying to do there, this has nothing to do with the nuclear deal anymore. This obviously they're trying to force regime change. And when you look at the history of the United States and regime change, they've been very, very unsuccessful, and they've destabilized many countries with this regime change fantasy that they have. And not only this, it's hurting the oil markets, it's hurting oil supply. The repercussions are very, very unthought of. They did not really think this through.
Right, but Mr. Yusuf, I hear you when you say that it has nothing to do with the nuclear deal anymore, but I can't help but draw a parallel, because when Trump withdrew from that without any shred of evidence that Iran was violating the deal, what happened in turn? It had a counter effect, didn't it? That they found a way around to have trade with Iran. Is that not true?
They worked on mechanisms to have trades with Iran, but I mean, when you look at the amount of trade, it's minuscule what it was compared to during the nuclear deal. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can't really call that trade. Iran was a country that was up and coming once again with the nuclear deal. It was developing, and frankly, it wasn't nuclear weapons were not a danger to anyone. They were abiding by the rules, abiding by the laws. And for America to unilaterally walk out of the deal without any evidence of Iran violating it is completely uncalled for. This type of transactional policies, this type of unilateral asymmetric relationship with countries, this has got to stop. It's
almost like a bullying attitude. And Mr. Matteo, announcing this withdrawal to these 8 countries, Doesn't this worsen the transatlantic divide that we are now seeing evolve more and more in the world?
Absolutely, it does. I grew up as an American diplomat and as a student of international relations from the foundation that transatlantic solidarity is the #1 goal of the United States in foreign policy, because when our allies are all working together, we are all safer and wealthier. So yes, this is another piece of President Trump's unilateralist, as well as Yusuf was just saying, transactional foreign policy in which you don't get a lot of coordination among the various goals. I think Trump doesn't like multilateral diplomacy because if your policy is America first, and America is the biggest country, then America, he thinks, does better if America can bully others. And so, yeah, this is really bad for transatlantic solidarity, and this is going to play out further, of course, when the U.S. and the EU sit down to try to negotiate a trade agreement in coming months.
Absolutely. And Mr. Khoshcheshm, Europe standing is how do you see it? Is Europe now standing side by side with Beijing and Moscow against the U.S. with this latest development more than ever before?
Well, what Trump is doing to force Tehran to the negotiating table would backfire, because the Chinese know pretty well that in addition to the cost that they have to incur if they replace Iranian crude, both Iran's heavy and light crude are of better quality compared with the quality of Saudi heavy crude and light crude. Therefore, there needs to be a lot of costs, for tuning up their refineries, and many old refineries would be worn out. So there will be costs. Each dollar of increase in crude prices would mean $170 billion of loss for the United States itself, and there will be repercussions, political repercussions for Donald Trump himself in the next year presidential election if prices continue to rise, similar to the past 6 months. The Chinese would also incur some losses, and they'll get angry. But more important than that, and more important than the losses that would be incurred by all energy consumers, is that Iran is an enemy of the United States. It shares a lot of political and economic and security issues with, the Chinese. They have a lot of, transactions. Now, replacing Saudi Arabia and UAE with Iran as the origin of supplies that happen to be under much influence of the United States, and its influence is way beyond that of China and these countries, would put the security of the supplies, for the Chinese at jeopardy. It would be a big threat to the security of energy supplies to China. So the Chinese have been working with Iran ever since Obama sanctions started. They've been working with Iran in order to bypass the sanctions, and they are already doing so. It's interesting to note that Iran has been finding new customers for its oil, and a major part of Iranian crude supplies have been sold to these new customers that have not received waivers. How? By bypassing the sanctions, energy swaps that Iran is doing. Only one of these ways would bring Iran somewhere around 1 million barrels of, supplies, of exports. If it's, used completely. Iran is using this last option because of the cost only for sending 100,000 barrels of oil abroad. So right. Iran still has more options. The Chinese know the cost.
Options. The Chinese know the cost. And with that, Mr. Matthew, America is now the world's largest oil producer in it. And is this what Trump was aiming for last year also when he first imposed sanctions on Iran? Can we see this as two birds with one stone?
The United States becoming the world's largest oil and natural gas producer, by the way, really has nothing to do with President Trump. I mean, it was something that was happening.
But the local prices of U.S. oil has gone up also.
Yeah, and so as the price has gone up, that creates a political liability for President Trump, again, as we look forward to next year's elections. But as the price goes up, that enables further investment in unconventional oil and gas, fracking, if you will, which is what has enabled the U.S. to become the world's largest producer of oil and gas. So the market adjusts, and it works. And in this case, higher oil prices are going to lead to investment that will then dampen the oil price or lower it, but it'll take some time. There's a delay before that new U.S. production will be available. So I don't think that's part of a coordinated strategy, the fact that there'll be more investment in U.S. oil and gas production. I think that's just a fact of life of the market right now.
Okay, so Mr. Yusuf, when Saudi Arabia says it wants to help Saudi Arabia and UAE with Iran out of the picture completely, meaning basically that 8 countries not buying oil from Iran gives a opening for OPEC to now replace 1 million barrels a day. Can they afford to do this at this point?
Well, it looks like OPEC is ready to replace Iran, and unfortunately, the loser from these sanctions is going to be the Iranian people, while the winner of these sanctions is going to be the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And designed for it to happen this way, that opens that question up. Everyone's going to have a doubt in their mind. How much did this have to do with the nuclear deal? How much did this have to do with ruining Iran's economy? And how much of this had to do with supporting Saudi Arabia as well? And frankly, I mean, when I look at this deal, when I look at the timing of these sanctions right now, you have to ask the question, was this done to help Saudi Arabia out? The Saudi economy has been in shambles lately.
But Saudi Arabia has been cautious this time, it seems, because considering how it felt burnt last year when it increased production to offset Iran sanctions, only to be blindsided by US's issuance of these waivers.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was blindsided last time, but this time the U.S. looks much more serious. You can see that Pompeo and Trump have much better correspondence with Saudi Arabia, and frankly, I feel like this was a very coordinated effort. Now, before you were saying that Iran is the enemy of the United States, I don't think Iran's an enemy of the United States. I don't think it's an ally, but to label Iran an enemy, I mean, when you look at American foreign policy, they have this, you're either with us or against us attitude. You're either our ally or you're our enemy. There is no in between. There's no gray area for any country. And frankly, this needs to be restructured. It's a multipolar world now. You have to respect China and Russia's power. It's not the post-USSR era anymore. The global order is changing, and countries need to have multilateral relations. They need to be able to talk to everyone. They need to be able to cultivate these relations. And just because Iran is not a U.S. ally should not make Iran an enemy. And when you look at America's policies towards Iran, America is the aggressor, not Iran.
Okay.
So,
all right.
Like I said, the timing of these sanctions are very, very suspect. The winners of these sanctions are suspect.
Right.
The loser, unfortunately, is the Iranian people.
Iranian people. Hold on to that thought, Yusuf. Now we're joined by Mr. Rajiv Desai, an analyst joining us from Delhi. Mr. Rajiv, can you shed some light on how do you think India will react to this new announcement by President Trump?
Apparently this is not. This has been announced in November, and so I guess government was aware that it comes to an end, the waivers on 1st of May.
There was a deadline given, but in the middle there was some talk with Congress that they might issue a renewal of these waivers. So this did sort of come as a surprise.
It's possible. It's entirely possible that it came as a surprise. But having said that, they'd already started to buy oil from the U.S. itself, anticipating this waiver being withdrawn. So that's the thing. But in the meantime, the prices have already, global prices have increased as much as 10%. Mm-hmm. And that's not been passed down to consumers here in India, which means the government has absorbed the additional the price increase. So its finances will be under pressure if oil prices, as likely, will increase even more. So
and the government has probably absorbed it because the elections are taking place.
Well, yes, the government does everything for elections. Yes, they have absorbed it.
What about the relationship that Iran and India has had historically? I mean, it really puts the Iranians, like our other guests have said, on the heat. Will India figure out a way to continue trade of oil with Iran because of their relations?
They have suggested that. No, actually, I don't know anything about what they've been discussing with Iran, but I do know that they've issued a statement that they were ready for it and they're looking at options and so on and so forth. So whether they can do something with Iran, I don't know. But I also know that a senior U.S. official is going to be visiting New Delhi next week. So I assume that there'll be some conversations on that score. Also, I think one of the things that this Indian government, especially Mr. Modi, has tom-tommed his close relationship with the U.S., specifically President Trump.
Right.
And so I think that's come under some scrutiny. Let's say, if he's so close to Mr. Trump, then why didn't he pick up the phone and call him? Because this is going to hurt a lot.
Right. And it's already hurting a lot in terms of geopolitical relations with each other, U.S. calling the shots here and deciding. But Mr. Khoshcheshm, we've talked about this. Iran has been the 5th largest producer. Obviously, losing these 8 countries is going to hit the economy hard, and it's already been suffering a lot from these U.S. sanctions.
Not hard. As a matter of fact, the decision would cut off a part of Iranian supplies. As I explained earlier, a major part of Iran's supplies in the last 6 months have been sold to new customers through bypassing the sanctions. So Iran has more possibilities to, bypass the sanctions, as I mentioned earlier in the program. Still, yes, that's true. Somewhere around 20 to 30% is believed to be cut off Iran's supplies, crude supplies to the market. And once this happens, the repercussions would be not just for Iran, but also for all major energy consumers. 3-4 months after the decision comes into effect, we will start hearing louder voices in opposition to the United States. So there will be political repercussions. In the meantime, we've been, discussing the economic repercussions and, oil prices and so on and so forth.
Right.
There are also geopolitical, repercussions here, because Iran would definitely blame the ones that have volunteered to replace its share in the market. That includes Saudi Arabia and the UAE, that has a very limited capacity, of course. And Iran would, one way or another,
figure out a way to. Right. So it doesn't really help for international relations at all for the Middle East. So, Mr. Matteo, very quickly, the closing comments from you. We're running out of time here. President Trump's, this is not the only policy which has thrown the Congress in a lot of confusion. I mean, recently what he did with acknowledging the Golan Heights, again, Turkey is already on very tense terms with the U.S. How do you see this moving forward?
Well, I think President Trump believes he has a coordinated Middle East policy. At the center of it is his belief that Iran actually is a U.S. enemy. Now, I'm not, necessarily disagreeing with Yusuf. He can have his own characterization of Iran, but certainly President Trump looks at Iran as America's maybe number 1, number 2 enemy. So the policy is to work with Saudi Arabia, with UAE. Turkey is on the other side, right? There's a big gulf between Saudi Arabia and UAE on one side and Turkey on the other, and that all focuses on Qatar. So I think President Trump thinks he's proceeding in a way that's wise, that's going to maximize pressure on Iran in the hope of changing the regime. But the fallout for transatlantic relations is enormous, and this is putting more weight on a very difficult U.S.-Turkey relationship at a time where the U.S. and Turkey need to be coming together to help stabilize northern.
Okay. Let me get you in, Yusuf. What's your closing remark on this? Something especially that Matthew highlighted, that this is a very tense relationship between U.S. and Turkey going further south.
I mean, it's a very tense relationship right now. Turkey's obviously expecting the delivery of the Russian air defense system, the S-400. America has said that if they receive this Russian weapon defense system, there's going to be sanctions on Turkey. On the other side, you have the U.S. Sanctioning now Iran oil, and if Turkey continues to buy more, they're going to get sanctioned from that. So there's sanction threats from 2 different flashpoints against Turkey. There's also support for the YPG in Syria. So as you can see, the U.S.-Turkey relationship is getting very, very stressed out right now, and this is definitely not good for the transatlantic union, because Turkey is a major player in NATO. Turkey is NATO's southern flank. It's the 2nd largest army right now. So when you look at this, how is this going to play out? We don't know. Turkey has said that the S-400 is a done deal, so we're going to have to see the U.S. reaction going forward. We need to remember that Turkey is a very important regional player when it comes to the Middle East and the Balkans. Yes. So I'm sure what they have to say is going to be very important. But unfortunately, President Trump's unilateral policies and not getting advice from Turkey or advice from other regional players.
And going ahead and making on his own is having its ramifications as we see it. But that's all the time we have right now to discuss this very extensive topic. I'd just like to thank very quickly Mr. Yusuf, Mr. Khoshcheshm, and Mr. Matteo for joining us and sharing your wonderful insight on this topic. We'll take a quick short break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Newswire. As we hashed out what the renewal of special waivers to 8 countries that have been importing oil from Iran meant, not just geopolitically, but also to oil prices in the earlier segment of our program, we will now continue to talk about how President Trump continues making odd moves that not just put oil supplies at risk, but also interfere in an ongoing crisis in Libya. While energy analysts have raised concerns of what would happen to Libya's 1 million odd barrels a day of oil production and export, the head of Libya's UN-recognized government has said that Trump's reaching out to General Haftar, who has earlier grabbed oil depots and is currently attacking Tripoli in his attempt to oust the UN-recognized government of Libya, how Trump's move can actually perpetuate the risk of disruption in the Libyan oil supply, not to mention perpetuate a crisis that is unfolding in this important country. So I'd like to welcome our guest here, Mr. Ahmed Sewehli, a democratic activist, is joining us from Manchester. We also have Dr. Matteo Capasso, an IR expert with the research associate and a research associate at the European University Institute in Italy. And he's also an expert of international relations and politics of the Middle East, especially Libya. It's good to have you on the show. And also we are joined by Dr. Bola Adediran. He is an IR expert, also and a senior lecturer in politics and international relations at the University of West England. Welcome to the show, all of you. I want to start with you, Dr. Matteo, about this announcement that came in later that President Trump has actually reached out to General Haftar. Is this Trump endorsing General Haftar?
Thank you, Ayza, for having me on the show. Yes and no, somehow. I mean, first and foremost, we need to remember that General Khalifa Haftar was one of the prisoners of war during the Libyan-Chadian war. The U.S. basically took him and shipped him to the U.S. After took American citizenship. We could go as far as say that basically Haftar is a CIA agent to a certain extent. Although, I mean, it's debatable. What we need to say, in any case, what this shows is that yes, there are strong connections between Haftar and the United States of America. Now, according to me, I would say that what the U.S. is trying to do is basically trying to suss out its cost-benefit analysis in the case of Libya. To me, the U.S. does not have a strong interest in the Libyan oil per se, which is more in the case of Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. But what it's important for the U.S., and I think we have been seeing this with Trump, particularly in the recent since the start of his administration, is that basically saying, okay, what can we get out of this situation? So certainly oil can be one of those, one of the interests of the United States of America. But what we can say also is that America does not want to get involved too much into this conflict. So it's trying to me also to understand what are the partners that we can trust in this case. Certainly what we see is that both Russia and the US are actually agreeing on having Haftar, as well as with the UAE. What we're seeing, as usual with the American, is the hypocritical stance and this crusade against democracy in the region, which basically means we are ready to support any authoritarian.
I'm glad you mentioned Moscow. I'm sorry to cut you here. I'm glad you mentioned Moscow here, Dr. Matteo, because while you say they're agreeing on backing Haftar, at the same time it puts really into question, is President Trump actually feeling the threat that Moscow might take over by backing a rebel he's hoping will take over?
I think what we are seeing more generally, the strategy of the U.S., and we have seen this in Syria as well, is that the U.S. cannot afford anymore to police the entire world. Somehow the American empire is in decline. So what we are witnessing, I think, is that America is trying to shift the way it polices the area. So it might get into alliances with Putin, if necessary, as long as, its main interests are under control. And I think a possible alliance is, in that sense, is not something that we should look at as if America is ready to or is fearing Moscow, but on the contrary is trying to work with Moscow, because actually America is in decline in terms of its power on the region. We've been seeing this since the end of Iraq.
But still, I would still play the devil's advocate here, and I would quote here the U.S. head of the Africa Command, General Waldhauser. He said to Congress last month that Russians were backing Haftar in part to influence the area on NATO's southern flank. I mean, Libya is playing right now, is positioned in a way it has a strategic importance.
That is true. That is true. I mean, we should, yes, absolutely, in the sense that there is part of it that America does not want Russia completely to take over the case of Libya, and what Russia has been doing until now, very, in a way, subtle, but also smarter manner than the US has been trying to basically put itself in between the two sides without really and necessarily taking side with one or the other. So the US somehow, I think, is trying to gain grounds with what the US, with what Russia has done. But I mean, what we see is that, I mean, America is basically trying to catch up with Russia in the case of Libya, because
it almost seems that it's sucked into this game by Russia, because let's face it, Trump's strategy has always been to withdraw from these wars, not fight them for the other countries or govern these other countries for them or tell them how to govern it. And yet at the same time, we see the top Democrat slam Trump for backing Haftar. I mean, there have been over 200 deaths, over 1,000 killed just in these past 2 weeks. What is he thinking backing Haftar?
I think that what you're saying is right, partly when you mention that basically Trump has been sucked up by Russia into the case of Libya. But let's not forget how everything started in 2011 in the case of Libya. The US was drawn into this conflict because it was the European powers who were not capable of dealing with the situation. So what we're seeing is that the more fragmentation at the European level is bringing in and is allowing space to third actors, whether it's going to be Russia or China, and at the same time, as you rightly pointed out, the US is not willing to dictate anymore what to do in the region. So yes, it's creating space for other international powers, and the US somehow is trying to find a way to maintain some sort of stake in the big pie, but we'll see what's going to happen here.
Let's see what's going to happen. Thank you so much, Dr. Matteo, for your input there. Mr. Ahmed, what's your take on it? Haftar has been facing allegations of cooperating with US intelligence agencies, considering his past and living in the US, just a few kilometers away from CIA headquarters in Washington.
I think the important thing to focus on now really is what Haftar is doing to the people of Libya. This has been going on for 5 years. So he's been dealing with many countries, and as your guest was just saying now, there's Russia, you mentioned France. France has been the big surprise really, because France helped Libyan people get rid of a dictator, Gaddafi, and now it seems that they are intent on putting a new dictator in power in Libya in the way of Haftar. And there's always this propaganda going on that Haftar's fighting terrorists, Haftar's fighting extremists, Haftar's fighting militias. It always changes, by the way. However, it's his forces, which are full of militias, and they are full of actually Salafi extremists who's recruited and who are the bulk of his real fighting force. And all he cares about, he has said it clearly, is that he thinks Libyans are not ready for democracy. What he really wants is to be the new dictator. France has helped him with intelligence. France has helped him in the Security Council by making sure that there's no resolution against Haftar and all the atrocities that he's committed. I mean, his people have executed people in the streets of Benghazi, of Derna.
Bola, let me come with you. This is no surprising new. I wouldn't, would you call it unprecedented that the US once again is backing a dictator known for war crimes, known for mass murders, and again, not exactly the perfect example of democracy?
No, it's not at all. The US has a long history of always acting only to further its own interests. For long years, it supported Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, and of course, when it was not suited to its interest, it backed down and failed to support Hosni Mubarak. So it's not surprising at all what the US has done. I think that what has been surprising recently is that there seems to be two different perspectives coming out from the US. One from the State Department, the State Department continues to support rhetorically. Whereas Trump seems to be taking a different position from the State Department. I think that's what's most surprising about this case for me.
So the conflicting statements that you mentioned only weeks after the State Department basically denounced the support to Haftar, or that what he was doing was essentially wrong. suddenly we see a change in tactics. Why? And here I'd like to welcome Mr. Sami Hamdi. He's a geopolitical risk advisor, and he's also the editor-in-chief of the International Interest, which is basically an online current affairs magazine. Welcome to the show. You're joining us from Tunisia. You see this sudden change in the U.S. backing Haftar?
I don't think necessarily it's a sudden change. I think we have to remember the context of Libya, which is that after this crisis, after this political deadlock between Tripoli and between Tobruk, I think there's been a clear signs from the US, from France, from Italy, that all they want is stability. All they want is an end to the war, and they want the oil shipments to keep continuing. Let's remember that after 6-7 months ago, he went to the oil ports in the north, and Trump threatened him because the oil prices went high and threatened to bomb him. Haftar withdrew and everything went back to normal.
So they have faith in General Haftar that he will be the one who will be able to secure that their oil prices or isn't disrupted, considering just a few weeks ago US pulled out troops from Libya, saying it was there was a lot of unrest there.
I think we have to remember, I don't think it's necessary that they trust Haftar. I think it's more a case of they are tired of the war and they want to see a finish. If Haftar can take Tripoli, it means that the war finishes. This is how they are calculating it. And at the end of the day, they back stability. Remember, in Egypt, Sisi overthrew the democratically elected president of Mohammed Morsi, and the US recognized Sisi, the Europe recognized Sisi. Haftar knows that the international community recognizes power, and Haftar is now demonstrating power in Tripoli. France, Italy, and the US are basically saying, look, we'll give you this window to take Tripoli. If you can take it quickly, we'll recognize you. If you can't take it quickly, it's back to negotiations once more. However, now they are dealing with realpolitik. They are dealing with the realities on the ground, which is that now that, according to them, there is terrorism. Libya has huge oil reserves. They are worried about the oil prices. They are worried that the parties are all armed. There are all these militias that don't want to sit together. They don't want to come together. Given that now that Haftar is using force, let's see where it goes. If he takes Tripoli, everybody will be forced to sit together and recognize him. For the US, France, and Italy, it is war fatigue. This is what has left them silent. This is what has left them saying to Haftar, look, take your chance, go, and let's see if you succeed. It is not that they support Haftar. It is that they are waiting to see if Haftar can end this war once and for all. And they will recognize the...
Right, but it still puts out the question that why General Haftar? That means that US, and this question is for you, Mr. Ahmed, the US has faith in not just the UN and recognized government in Tripoli in winning this offensive that General Haftar has basically escalated, but they have more faith in General Haftar. It has a lot to say about the region's sort of destability.
I think the U.S. administration, like in many other issues, is split on this. Secretary Pompeo made it clear only about a week ago that he was against any Haftar advance on Tripoli and that Haftar should be going back to his bases in the east. And then there was this possible President Trump call that we still don't know the details about, really. So I think there's a split there. And I think that the establishment, let's say in America, really doesn't want Haftar to advance. They know that he's not a force of stability. The only thing that he will do is cause a protracted war. He cannot take Tripoli. With the forces that he has, as I said earlier, they've been pushed back. So there can't be any stability. The only thing that Haftar is causing at the moment is instability. We're already seeing that oil production is being cut in Libya. We know that there are more ISIS groups now in the south of the country coming back, and that's because of Haftar's wars there just earlier on, just maybe a couple of months ago, where, again, he just left it in a state of complete disarray. So I think America will, in the end, probably listen to its ally, the United Kingdom, and Jeremy Hunt, Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt, made it very clear from the beginning that Haftar's attack was unacceptable, and he has been calling for resolutions against Haftar. As I said, the issue has been France and indeed Russia, who have vetoed any possible resolution against Haftar at the moment. But he's losing on the ground. The thing is, he's losing on the ground, and the only way that he can make advances is through foreign air power. And if there's going to be foreign air power, then you can look at a massive war in the Mediterranean, basically, because there are countries who are completely against Haftar, such as Italy. And Italy has made it very clear to France that they're not accepting this. Egypt, of course, is backing Haftar, as is the United Arab Emirates and Saudi. It's the usual trio, unfortunately, of being anti-democracy and just wanting to cause wars in the region. And we've seen what's happened in Yemen. We've seen what's happened in in Syria. They want to try and make Libya into another Syria. And I think
and this is a place we've already been facing a lot of unrest since 2011, as our guest earlier said. Dr. Bola, let me ask you this. So when Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, who's been always siding with Donald Trump on pretty much every policy, he comes out and says that he's worried about what the strategy U.S. has in mind for backing General Haftar. Doesn't this also give support indirectly to General Haftar, encouragement, confidence to continue this attack on Tripoli? I mean, it doesn't really go with any kind of support on making this a peaceful or a political sort of solution instead of a military one.
I think that the chances of a political solution to this crisis has been severely undermined by Trump's actions over the last few days. What we were thinking was going to happen was that the national conference was going to happen between April 14th and 15th. And that has obviously, after calculated that it was better for him to seize power before the national conference and reduce the chances that he would get just a part rule in a subsequent national coalition of actors in Libya. But I think what is also very important is to realize that after his plane already has a strong hand in Libya. It controls 2/3 of the country. And so there is a sense in which part of the calculation of the U.S. has also been that pivot towards Haftar is to realize that Haftar seems to be the best possibility to guarantee peace and security within Libya. Unfortunately, there is a sense in which Haftar does not also have predominant power to completely take over Tripoli, and that's where we are now. We're in a state of. It seems that what is going on in Libya is going to be clearly a civil war over the next couple of weeks if Haftar does not pull out his forces from the edges of Tripoli.
Right, Mr. Sami, was it about the U.S. position with Khalifa Haftar that caused a flip? Well, what was the sort of milestone event that happened in the Middle East that made them change their position?
I think people exaggerated a bit too much with regards to what the original U.S. position was. I mean, compare it to when Haftar took the oil ports. It was clear the U.S. said, Haftar, get out of those oil ports or we will bomb you and put you on the sanctions list. The statement from that came originally was more kind of, Haftar, we don't like what you're doing, maybe you should step back a bit. It was not the same statement that came out with regards to the oil ports. It was not like U.S. statements in the past where you can feel there is going to be a threat and the U.S. is going to do something. Moreover, the fact that U.S. troops withdrew from Libya showed that the talk was one thing, but the actions were another. The Americans were withdrawing their troops, saying we're not going to protect this internationally recognized government. In other words, giving an implied green light to Haftar to say, look, we can't back you openly, but let's see what you can do in Tripoli. I think people exaggerated too much with regards to the U.S. position originally when Haftar came. Also, it's worth noting that I know it's easy to say that Haftar is the one who has caused all of this chaos, and he plays a huge part. But remember, the militias in Tripoli were fighting each other not too long ago. Remember that Sarraj, the head of the internationally recognized government, had to return to Tripoli by night and by sea because the militias were waiting to prevent him from entering Tripoli. It is the militias inside Tripoli who could not agree between themselves. When the US is looking at the situation in Libya, it says, I see Haftar in the east, who has managed to keep the tribes quiet and who has managed at least to cement some sort of control. But I see Tripoli where the militias can't even march. And I think the proof that the militias feel there is a real threat is that even the militias from Misrata was always fighting the militias in Tripoli, always antagonistic. They abandoned that antagonism and came running to Tripoli to try to help these militias to fight Haftar, in a clear sign that they believe that this time Haftar is a genuine threat. He has marched into Tripoli, he has got within 11 kilometers of the airport. This is very serious for them. And I think the reason when we look at negotiations, it's not just Haftar. The militias in Tripoli were also the ones delaying negotiations and the like. So the US, when it is calculating, it gave the original statement as, okay, we have to say something, let's say this. But in reality, they are waiting and seeing.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Sami, for your valuable insight. I'd also like to thank Dr. Bola, Dr. Matteo, and Mr. Ahmed for talking to us here on Newswire on this expansive topic. But we've run out of time. We will see you tomorrow. Till then, goodbye.